Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being recorded for the December 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of The New Faction of Conciliators, or the Virtuous, by Lenin from 1911. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So currently we are on a track of fleshing out the Lenin against Trotsky playlist, and most recently we've been covering texts from Lenin's struggle against liquidationism. This was an extreme form of Menshevism, which was the more reformist wing of the Russian Marxist Party, and this particularly extreme form of it arose in the 1908 to 1911 counter-revolutionary period. This text overall is going to be a lot easier to understand if you go back to some of the earlier texts and study those. But basically, Lenin here was trying to hold the party together and defend it against attacks by this liquidationist group, which was trying to completely dissolve the illegal underground wing of the party, which is the heart of the actual revolutionary struggle. The legal organizations really are just supposed to be in service to and directed by that. So just because the ruling order was forced in the 1905 to 1907 First Russian Revolutionary period, was forced to make certain concessions and grant more civil rights, it doesn't mean that you can rely on that. After all, how did you get them to grant you those concessions? Revolutionary activity. Anyway, you had the liquidators trying to dissolve the illegal part of the party, and then you also had the Otsevists, or recallists, who wanted to basically dissolve the legal part of the party and recall the group that the Russian Marxist Party or the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party had sent into the new Russian parliament. So Lenin, as the head of the Bolshevik faction within the party, the more revolutionary wing, argued that the party needed a mix of legal and illegal activity. Therefore, both liquidationism and Otsevism were wrong, and their emergence was a symptom of bourgeois influence on the party. Then the liquidationists and the Otsevists started working together, and Trotsky facilitated this entire thing and, as Lenin said, acted as their attorney in the court of public opinion, trying to sell this to the workers. So at this point, in October 1911, they were several years into the struggle. The party had formally declared this to be a problem to be dealt with, and then didn't deal with it throughout the entirety of 1910. And then the last piece that we read was from June 1911, which was a resolution putting forward the Bolshevik position on this entire situation and how to resolve it. The other side then responded in August with attacks on Lenin, and then Lenin wrote this to respond to that. We should note here also that when Lenin refers to conciliators, it's not a compliment. This is basically a reference to people who are trying to reconcile the irreconcilable, which is just going to result in a destruction of principle, and he saw Trotsky as being in that role. So really, this is a pseudo-conciliationism, which is destructive. So this piece was first published in Sozialdemokrat number 24, October 18, 1911, signed N. Lenin. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 17, translated by Dora Cox. HTML transcription and markup by R. Symbala, and you can find it at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Let's begin. The Information Bulletin of the Technical Commission Abroad, number 1, August 11, 1911. This was the factional organ of the Conciliators published in Paris. And the message to all members of the RSDLP, signed by, quote, a group of pro-party Bolsheviks, which appeared almost simultaneously in Paris, are attacks identical in substance upon, quote, official Bolshevism, or, according to another expression, upon the, quote, Leninist Bolsheviks. These documents are full of ire. They contain more angry exclamations and declamations than real substance. Nevertheless, it is necessary to deal with them, for they touch upon the most important problems of our party. It is all the more natural for me to undertake the job of assessing the new faction, first because it was I who wrote on these very questions in the name of all the Bolsheviks exactly a year and a half ago. See Discussioni Listok number 2. This is a reference to Notes of a Publicist, which we have on the channel. And secondly, because I am fully conscious of my responsibility for, quote, official Bolshevism. As regards the expression Leninist, it is merely a clumsy attempt at sarcasm, intended to insinuate that it is only a question of the supporters of a single person. In reality, everybody knows perfectly well that it is not a question of people sharing my personal views on this or that aspect of Bolshevism. The authors of this message, who sign themselves pro-party Bolsheviks, also call themselves non-factional Bolsheviks, remarking that, quote, here, in Paris, they are, quote, rather ineptly called conciliators. Actually, as the reader will see from what follows, this name, which gained currency over 15 months ago, not only in Paris, not only abroad, but also in Russia, is the only one that correctly expresses the political essence of the new faction. Conciliationism is the totality of moods, strivings, and views that are indissolubly bound up with the very essence of the historical task confronting the RSDLP during the period of the counter-revolution of 1908 to 11. That is why, during this period, a number of social democrats proceeding from essentially different premises lapsed, so to speak, into conciliationism. Trotsky expressed conciliationism more consistently than anyone else. He was probably the only one who attempted to give the trend a theoretical foundation, namely, factions and factionism, expressing the struggle of the intelligentsia, quote, for influence over the immature proletariat. The proletariat is maturing, and factionalism is perishing of itself. The root of the process of fusion of the factions is not the change in the relations between the classes, not the evolution of the fundamental ideas of the two principal factions, Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, but the observance, or otherwise, of agreements concluded between all the quote-unquote intellectual factions. For a long time now, Trotsky, who at one moment has wavered more to the side of the Bolsheviks, and at another more to that of the Mensheviks, has been persistently carrying on propaganda for an agreement, or compromise, between all and sundry factions. So a comment here, this is a really interesting passage because we say that Trotskyism is a kind of crypto-Menshevism rooted in this petty bourgeois intellectualism, and that it also isn't a coherent ideology, but an adventurous trend. And what Lenin is saying in this passage is it's logical that Trotsky is the one who is rounding up all these factions, who are essentially these intellectualists striving for influence over the proletariat, even though some of them, like the liquidationists and the Otzevists, want completely the opposite thing. One wants the illegal wing liquidated, the other wants the legal wing liquidated. What would they have in common? But they're all coming together because factionalism is perishing as the proletariat matures and rejects that intellectualist influence. So all these people are coming together and banding together as their ship goes down, trying to use each other's support to hold on, and Trotsky is captain of the ship. Continuing, the opposite view of an agreement between all and sundry factions, see numbers 2 and 3 of the Discussioni Lestak. That would be Notes of a Publicist and the Historical Meaning of the Inter-Party Struggle in Russia. We have both on the channel. Is that the origin of the factions is to be traced to the relations between the classes in the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks only formulated the answers to the questions with which the objective realities of 1905 to 7 confronted the proletariat. Therefore, only the inner evolution of these factions, of the, quote, strong factions, strong because of their deep roots, strong because their ideas correspond to certain aspects of objective reality, only the inner evolution of precisely these factions is capable of securing a real fusion of the factions, i.e. the creation of a genuinely and completely united party of proletarian Marxist socialism in Russia. From this follows the practical conclusion that only a rapprochement and practical work between these two strong factions, and only insofar as they rid themselves of the non-social democratic tendencies of liquidationism and Otzevism, represents a real party policy, a policy that really brings about unity, not easily, not smoothly, and by no means immediately, but in a way that will produce actual results, as distinguished from the heap of quack promises of an easy, smooth, immediate fusion of, quote, all factions. These two views were observed even before the plenary meeting, when in my talks I suggested the slogan, rapprochement between the two strong factions and no whining about dissolving factions. This was made public immediately after the meeting by Golos Socialdemokrata. I plainly, definitely, and systematically explained these two views in May 1910, i.e. 18 months ago. Moreover, I did this in the general party arena in Discussioni Lestak number 2. If the conciliators with whom we have been arguing on these subjects since November 1909 have not so far found time to answer that article even once and have not made even one attempt to examine this question more or less systematically, to expound their views more or less openly and consistently, it is entirely their own fault. They call their factional statement, which was published on behalf of a separate group, a public answer. But this public answer of those who kept silent for over a year is not an answer to the question that was raised long ago, discussed long ago, and answered long ago in two fundamentally different ways. It is a most hopeless muddle, a most incredible confusion of two irreconcilable answers. Every proposition the authors of the message put forward, they immediately refute. In every single proposition, the alleged Bolsheviks, who in reality are inconsistent Trotskyites, echo Trotsky's mistakes. Indeed, look at the main ideas contained in the message. Who are its authors? They say that they are Bolsheviks who, quote, do not share the organizational views of official Bolshevism, unquote. That looks as if it were an opposition only on the question of organization, does it not? Read the next sentence, quote, it is precisely the organizational questions, the questions of building and restoring the party, that are being put in the forefront now, as was the case 18 months ago, unquote. This is quite untrue and constitutes the very error of principle which Trotsky made and which I exposed a year and a half ago. At the plenary meeting, the organizational question probably seemed of paramount importance only because and only insofar as the rejection of liquidationism by all factions was taken to be real, because the Golos and the Viperiod representatives, quote, signed the resolutions against liquidationism and against Otsevism to console the party. Trotsky's error was in continuing to pass off the apparent for the real after February 1910, when Nash Azaria finally unfurled the banner of liquidationism and the Viperiod group in their notorious school at X. This was a school held in Capri in 1909, and it was the factional center of the Otsevists, organized by A.A. Bogdanov, unfurled the banner of defense of Otsevism. At the plenary meeting, the acceptance of the apparent for the real may have been the result of self-delusion, but after it, ever since the spring of 1910, Trotsky has been deceiving the workers in a most unprincipled and shameless manner by assuring them that the obstacles to unity were principally, if not wholly, of an organizational nature. This deceit is being continued in 1911 by the Paris Conciliators, for to assert now that the organizational questions occupy the first place is sheer mockery of the truth. In reality, it is by no means the organizational question that is now in the forefront, but the question of the entire program, the entire tactics, and the whole character of the party, or rather a question of two parties, the Social Democratic Labor Party and the Stolypin Labor Party of Patrusov, Smirnov, Larin, Levitsky, and their friends. The Paris Conciliators seem to have been asleep for the 18 months that have elapsed since the plenary meeting, during which time the entire struggle against the liquidators shifted, both in our camp and among the pro-party Mensheviks, from organizational questions to questions of whether the party is to be a social democratic and not a liberal labor party. To argue now, let's say, with the gentlemen of Nash Azaria about organizational questions, about the relative importance of the legal and illegal organizations, would be simply putting on an act, for these gentlemen may fully recognize an illegal organization like Golos, which is subservient to the liquidators. It has been said long ago that the cadets, the main bourgeois party, are recognizing and maintaining an illegal organization that serves monarchist liberalism. The conciliators call themselves Bolsheviks in order to repeat, a year and a half later, and specifically stating, moreover, that this was done in the name of Bolshevism as a whole, Trotsky's errors which the Bolsheviks had exposed. Well, is this not an abuse of established party titles? Are we not obliged after this to let all and sundry know that the conciliators are not Bolsheviks at all, that they have nothing in common with Bolshevism, that they are simply inconsistent Trotskyites? Read a little further, quote, one may disagree with the way official Bolshevism and the majority of the editors of the central organ understood the task of the struggle against liquidationism, unquote. Is it really possible seriously to assert that the task of the struggle against liquidationism is an organizational task? The conciliators themselves declare that they differ from the Bolsheviks not only on organizational questions, but on what exactly do they differ? They are silent on this. Their public answer continues to remain the answer of people who prefer to keep silent, or shall we say, are irresponsible. For a year and a half, they did not attempt even once to correct, quote, official Bolshevism, or to expound their own conception of the task of the struggle against liquidationism. And official Bolshevism has waged this struggle for exactly 3 years, since August 1908. In comparing these well-known dates, we involuntarily seek for an explanation of this strange silence of the conciliators, and this quest involuntarily recalls to our mind Trotsky and Yonov, one of the Bund leaders, who asserted that they too were opposed to the liquidators, but that they understood the task of combating them differently. It is ridiculous, comrades, to declare, 3 years after the struggle began, that you understand the character of the struggle differently. Such a difference in understanding amounts to not understanding it at all. To proceed. In substance, the present party crisis undoubtedly reduces itself to the question whether our party, the RSDLP, should completely dissociate itself from the liquidators, including the Golos group, or whether it should continue the policy of compromise with them. It is doubtful whether any social democrat at all familiar with the case would deny that this question constitutes the essence of the entire party situation today. How do the conciliators answer this question? They write in the message, quote, "We are told that thereby, i.e. by supporting the meeting, we are violating the party forms and are causing a split. We do not think so, but even if this were the case, we would not be afraid of it," unquote. Then follows a statement to the effect that the plenary meeting was sabotaged by the Central Committee Bureau abroad, that the, quote, "Central Committee is the object of a gamble, that, quote, party forms have begun to be filled in with a factional content, etc." This answer can truly be called a classical specimen of ideological and political helplessness. Think of it. They're being accused, they say, of causing a split. And so the new faction, which claims to be able to show the way the party should go, declares publicly and in print, "We do not think so." i.e., you do not think that there is or that there will be a split, but, quote, "we would not be afraid of it," unquote. You can be sure that no other such example of confusion is to be found in the history of political parties. If you do not think that there is or that there will be a split, then explain why. Explain why it is possible to work with the liquidators. Say outright that it is possible and therefore necessary to work with them. Our conciliators not only do not say this, they say the opposite. In the leading article of the Bulletin, number 1, it is specifically stated in a footnote that this article was opposed by a Bolshevik who was an adherent of the Bolshevik platform, i.e. of the resolution of the Second Paris Group, which we also have on the channel. We read the following, quote, "It is a fact that joint work with the liquidators in Russia is impossible," unquote. While somewhat earlier, it is admitted that it is, quote, "becoming more and more difficult to draw even the finest line of demarcation," unquote, between the Golos group and the liquidators. Who can make head or tail of this? On the one hand, a highly official statement is made on behalf of the Technical Commission, in which the conciliators and the Poles, who now support them, constitute a majority against us Bolsheviks, that joint work is impossible. In plain language, this means declaring a split. The word split has no other meaning. On the other hand, the same Bulletin number 1 proclaims that the Technical Commission was set up, quote, "not for the purpose of bringing about a split, but for the purpose of averting it," unquote. And the selfsame conciliators write that they, quote, "do not think so, that there is or that there will be a split." Can one imagine a greater muddle? If joint work is impossible, that can be explained to Social Democrats and justified in their eyes either by an outrageous violation of party decisions and obligations on the part of a certain group of persons, and then a split with that group of persons is inevitable, or by a fundamental difference in principle, a difference which causes the entire work of a certain trend to be directed away from social democracy, and then a split with the whole trend is inevitable. As we know, we have both these things. The plenary meeting of 1910 declared it impossible to work with the liquidationist trend, while the split with the Golos group, which violated all its obligations and definitely went over to the liquidators, is now taking place. Anyone who consciously says that joint work is impossible, anyone who has given any thought to the statement and has grasped its fundamental principles, would inevitably concentrate all their attention and efforts on explaining these principles to the broadest masses so that those masses might be spared as soon and as completely as possible all futile and harmful attempts to maintain any relations whatsoever with those with whom it is impossible to work. But anyone who makes this statement and at the same time adds, quote, "we do not think there will be a split, quote, but we would not be afraid of it," reveals by their confused and timid language that they are afraid of themselves, afraid of the step they have taken, afraid of the situation that has been created. The message of the conciliators produces just such an impression. They are trying to vindicate themselves for something, to appear to be kind-hearted in the eyes of someone, to give someone a hint. Later on, we shall learn the meaning of their hints to Period and Pravda. We must first finish with the question of how the conciliators interpret the results of the period that has elapsed since the plenary meeting, the results summed up by the meeting of the members of the Central Committee. It is really necessary to understand these results, to understand why they were inevitable. Otherwise, our participation in events will be spontaneous, helpless, casual. Now, see how the conciliators understand this. How do they answer the question of why the work and the decisions of the plenary meeting, which were primarily meant to bring about unity, resulted in a split between the Central Committee Bureau abroad, meaning the liquidators, and the anti-liquidators? Our inconsistent Trotskyites have simply copied the answer to this from Trotsky and Yonov. and I'm forced to repeat what I said in last May against those consistent conciliators. Again, that's a reference to Notes of a Publicist, 1910. The conciliators answer by saying it is the fault of factionalism, the factionalism of the Mensheviks, of a period group, and of Pravda. We enumerate the factional groups in the order in which they appear in the message. And finally, of the, quote, official representatives of Bolshevism who, quote, have probably outdone all these groups in their factional efforts, unquote. The authors of the message openly and definitely apply the term non-factional only to themselves, the Paris conciliators. All are wicked, they are virtuous. The conciliators give no ideological reasons in explanation of the phenomenon in question. They do not point to any of the organizational or other distinguishing features of the groups that gave rise to this phenomenon. They say nothing, not a word, to explain matters, except that factionalism is a vice and non-factionalism a virtue. The only difference between Trotsky and the conciliators in Paris is that the latter regard Trotsky as a factionalist and themselves as non-factional, whereas Trotsky holds the opposite view. I must confess that this formulation of the question, in which political phenomena are explained only by the wickedness of some and the virtue of others, always calls to mind those outwardly benevolent faces of which one cannot help thinking, probably a rogue. What do you think of the following comparison? Our conciliators are non-factional, virtuous. We Bolsheviks have outdone all groups in our factional efforts, i.e., we're the most wicked. Therefore, the virtuous faction supported the most wicked, the Bolshevik faction, in its fight against the Central Committee Bureau abroad. There's something wrong here, comrades. You're confusing matters more and more with every statement you make. You make yourselves ridiculous when you and Trotsky hurl accusations of factionalism at one another, as if you were playing at ball. You do not take the trouble to think what is a faction. Try to give a definition, and we predict that you will entangle yourselves still more. For you yourselves are a faction, a vacillating, unprincipled faction, one that failed to understand what took place at the plenary meeting and after it. A faction is an organization within a party, united not by its place of work, language, or other objective conditions, but by a particular platform of views on party questions. The authors of the message are a faction because the message constitutes their platform, and a very bad one, but there are factions with wrong platforms. They're a faction because, like every other organization, they are bound by internal discipline. Their group appoints its representatives to the Technical Commission and to the Organizing Commission by a majority of votes. It was their group that drew up and published the message program, and so on. Such are the objective facts which show that outcries against factionalism are bound to be hypocrisy. Yet Trotsky and the inconsistent Trotskyites maintain that they are not a faction because, quote, the only object of their uniting into a faction is to abolish factions and to advocate their fusion, etc. But all such assurances are merely self-praise and a cowardly game of hide-and-seek, for the simple reason that the fact that a faction exists is not affected by any, even the most virtuous, aim of the faction. Every faction is convinced that its platform and its policy are the best means of abolishing factions, for no one regards the existence of factions as ideal. The only difference is that factions with clear, consistent, integral platforms openly defend their platforms, while unprincipled factions hide behind cheap shouts about their virtue, about their non-factionalism. Damn. What is the reason for the existence of factions in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party? They exist as the continuation of the split of 1903 to 05. They are the result of the weakness of the local organizations which are powerless to prevent the transformation of literary groups that express new trends, big and small, into new factions, i.e., into organizations in which internal discipline takes first place. How can the abolition of factions really be guaranteed? Let's listen. Only by completely healing the split, which dates from the time of the revolution. And this will be brought about only by ridding the two main factions of liquidationism and Otzevism, and by creating a proletarian organization strong enough to force the minority to submit to the majority. As long as no such organization exists, the only thing that might accelerate the process of their disappearance is an agreement by all the factions. Hence, both the ideological merit of the plenary meeting and its conciliationist error become clear. Its merit was the rejection of the ideas of liquidationism and Otzevism. Its mistake was the agreement concluded indiscriminately with persons and groups whose deeds are not in accordance with their promises. Quote, they signed the resolution. The ideological rapprochement on the basis of the fight against liquidationism and Otzivism goes ahead, despite all obstacles and difficulties. The conciliationist mistake of the plenary meeting, again see Notes of a Publicist 1910, specifically Part 2, quite inevitably brought about the failure of its conciliatory decisions, i.e. the failure of the alliance with the Golos group. The rupture between the Bolsheviks, and later also between the meeting of the members of the Central Committee and the Central Committee Bureau Abroad, corrected the conciliationist mistake of the plenary meeting. The rapprochement of the factions which are actually combating liquidationism and Otzivism will now proceed despite the forms decided on by the plenary meeting, for these forms did not correspond to the content. Conciliationism in general, as well as the conciliationism of the plenary meeting, came to grief because the content of the work separated the liquidators from the Social Democrats, and all the forms, diplomacy, and games of the conciliators could not overcome this process of separation. From this and only this point of view, which I developed in May 1910, everything that took place after the plenary meeting becomes intelligible, inevitable, resulting not from the wickedness of some and the virtue of others, but from the objective course of events, which isolates the liquidationist trend and brushes aside all the intermediate, major, and minor groups. Quick comment here, I don't want to break Lenin's flow because he's really on a roll, but as this is going into the Lenin against Trotsky playlist, which a lot of people object to because, oh well, Lenin eventually forgave all this stuff. No, the point is, yes, Trotsky and his group were admitted into the Bolsheviks in 1917 due to very particular circumstances of the unfolding revolution, and on condition that they would renounce their factionalism and become good Bolsheviks with time, which for a while seemed to work okay, especially as there was a civil war going on. Trotsky had a lot to do. But what happens after that? As the war winds down and the process of socialist construction begins, the factionalism, the Trotskyism, resurfaces. And I will do a video in the future about that period of when Trotsky joined the Bolsheviks and the brief period of harmony there, relative harmony, after we've fleshed out more of this backstory, because the backstory is what basically resurfaces in that post-Revolutionary War period. If you look at the pre-1917 history of Trotsky's behavior, it's very similar. And it's not due to Stalin's behavior or some conflict with any other particular individual. This is the trend that he exhibited, Trotsky exhibited, basically the whole time, the whole history of the RSDLP. And that brief period of relative harmony is the exception. So when we read here, Lenin pushing back on this Trotskyite narrative of the virtue of some and the wickedness of others, not really talking about the objective developments, doesn't it remind you of common Trotskyite framing of the conflict between Trotsky and Stalin, and the eventual expulsion of Trotsky from the party and then from the Soviet Union? Personal opinion, Lenin would have ended up doing the exact same thing had he lived longer, because this basically is Trotsky, and that's the point of this playlist. So, yeah, don't organize around Trotsky. Continuing. In order to obscure this undoubted political fact, the complete failure of conciliationism, the conciliators are forced to resort to a downright distortion of facts. Just listen to this. Quote, the factional policy of the Leninist Bolsheviks was particularly harmful because they had a majority in all the principal party institutions, so that their factional policy justified the organizational separatism of other trends and armed those trends against the official party institutions. Unquote. This tirade is nothing but a cowardly and belated pseudo-justification of liquidationism, for it is precisely the representatives of that tendency who have always justified themselves by references to the, quote, factionalism of the Bolsheviks. This justification is belated because it was the duty of every real party member, in contrast to persons who use the catchword pro-party for self-advertisement, to act at the time when this factionalism began, not a year and a half later. The conciliators, the defenders of liquidationism, could not and did not act earlier because they had no facts. They're taking advantage of the present time of troubles in order to give prominence to the unfounded arguments of the liquidators. But the facts are explicit and unambiguous. Immediately after the plenary meeting, in February 1910, Mr. Patrusov unfurled the banner of liquidationism. Soon after, in February or March, Messrs. Mikhail, Roman, and Yuri betrayed the party. Immediately after that, the Golos group started a campaign for Golos. See Plekhanov's diary the day following the plenary meeting, and resumed the publication of Golos. Immediately after that, the Viperiod people began to build up their own quote-unquote school. The first factional step of the Bolsheviks, on the other hand, was to found Rabochaya Gazeta in September 1910, after Trotsky's break with the representatives of the Central Committee. Why did the conciliators resort to such a distortion of well-known facts? In order to give a hint to the liquidators and curry favor with them. On the other hand, quote, joint work with the liquidators is impossible, unquote. On the other hand, they are, quote, justified by the factionalism of the Bolsheviks. We ask any social democrat not contaminated with emigre diplomacy what political confidence can be placed in people who are themselves entangled in such contradictions. All they deserve are the bouquets with which Golos publicly rewarded them. By factionalism, the conciliators mean the ruthlessness of our polemics, for which they have censured us thousands of times at general meetings in Paris, and the ruthlessness of our exposure of the liquidators. They were against exposing Mikhail, Yuri, and Roman. The conciliators have been defending and screening the liquidators all the time, but have never dared to express their defense openly, either in the Discussioni Lestat or in any printed public appeal. And now they are using their impotence and cowardice to put a spoke in the wheel of the party, which has begun emphatically to dissociate itself from the liquidators. The liquidators say there is no liquidationism. It is a, quote, exaggeration on the part of the Bolsheviks. Note here, this is a reference to the resolution on liquidationism, which was adopted by the Conference of Transcaucasian Social Democratic Organizations, which was really a conference of Caucasian liquidators. The anti-party nature of this conference was exposed in correspondence published in number 24 of Sozialdemokrat of October 18, 1911. Back to the main text. And Trotsky's speeches. The conciliators say it is impossible to work with the liquidators, but the factionalism of the Bolsheviks provides them with a, quote, justification. Is it not clear that this ridiculous contradiction of subjective opinions has one and only one real meaning? Cowardly defense of liquidationism, a desire to trip up the Bolsheviks and lend support to the liquidators. But this is by no means all. The worst and most malicious distortion of facts is the assertion that we had a, quote, majority in the, quote, principal party institutions, unquote. This crying untruth has only one purpose, to cover up the political bankruptcy of conciliationism. For in reality, the Bolsheviks did not have a majority in any of the principal party institutions after the plenary meeting. On the contrary, it was the conciliators who had the majority. We challenge anyone to attempt to dispute the following facts. After the plenary meeting, there were only 3 principal party institutions. 1, the Central Committee Bureau in Russia, composed chiefly of conciliators, and Lenin makes a note here that, of course, not all conciliators are alike, and surely not all the former members of the Russian Bureau could and would accept responsibility for all the pompous stupidities of the Paris conciliators who are merely echoing Trotsky. Back to the main text. 2, the Central Committee Bureau abroad, on which from January to November 1910 the Bolsheviks were represented by a conciliator. Since the Bundist and the Latvian officially adopted the conciliationist standpoint, the majority, during 11 months following the plenary meeting, was conciliationist. 3, the editorial board of the central organ, on which 2, quote, Bolshevik factionalists were opposed by 2 Golos supporters. Without the poll, there was no majority. Why did the conciliators have to resort to a deliberate lie? For no other purpose than that of camouflage, to cover up the political bankruptcy of conciliationism. Conciliationism predominated at the plenary meeting. It had a majority in all the principal practical centers of the party after the plenary meeting, and within a year and a half it suffered complete collapse. It failed to reconcile anyone. It did not create anything anywhere. It vacillated helplessly from side to side, and for that it fully deserved the bouquets of Golos. The conciliators suffered the most complete failure in Russia, and the more assiduously and demagogically the Paris conciliators refer to Russia, the more important is it to stress this. The leitmotif of the conciliators is that Russia is conciliationist in contrast with what we have abroad. Compare these words with the facts, and you will see that this is just hollow, cheap demagogy. The facts show that for more than a year after the plenary meeting, there were only conciliators on the Central Committee Bureau in Russia. They alone made official reports about the plenary meeting and officially negotiated with the legalists. They alone appointed agents and sent them to the various institutions. They alone handled all the funds that were sent unquestioningly by the Central Committee Bureau abroad. They alone negotiated with the, quote, Russian writers who seemed promising contributors to the muddle, i.e. in respect of conciliationism, etc. And the result? The result is nil. Not a single leaflet, not a single pronouncement, not a single organ of the press, not a single conciliation. As against this, the Bolshevik, quote, factionalists have put their Robochaya Gazeta, published abroad, on its feet after 2 issues, to say nothing of other matters about which only Mr. Martov speaks openly, thereby helping the secret police. Conciliationism is nil. Words. empty wishes, and attempts to trip up Bolshevism on the basis of these conciliatory wishes. Quote, official Bolshevism has proved by deeds that it is absolutely preponderant precisely in Russia. Is this an accident, the result of arrests? But arrests spared the liquidators who did no work in the party while they mowed down Bolsheviks and conciliators alike. No, this is not an accident or the result of the luck or success of individuals. It is the result of the bankruptcy of a political tendency which is based on false premises. The very foundation of conciliationism is false. The wish to base the unity of the party of the proletariat on an alliance of all factions, including the anti-social democratic, non-proletarian factions. False are its unprincipled unity schemes which lead to nothing. False are its phrases against factions when in fact a new faction is formed, phrases that are powerless to dissolve the anti-party factions but are intended to weaken the Bolshevik faction, which bore 9/10 of the brunt of the struggle against liquidationism and Otzevism. Trotsky provides us with an abundance of instances of scheming to establish unprincipled pseudo-unity. Recall, for example, I take one of the most recent instances, how he praised the Paris Robochia Жизнь. Translating to Workers' Life, this was a monthly organ of the Menshevik Golos Group and the Conciliators. Published in Paris, it had 3 issues, in the management of which the Paris Conciliators and the Golos Group had an equal share. How wonderful, wrote Trotsky, quote, neither Bolshevik nor Menshevik, but revolutionary social democrat, unquote. The poor hero of phrasemongering failed to notice a mere bagatelle. Only that social democrat is revolutionary who understands how harmful anti-revolutionary pseudo-social democracy can be in a given country at a given time, i.e. the harm of liquidationism and Otzevism in the Russia of the 1908 to 10 period, and who knows how to fight against such non-social democratic tendencies. By his praise of Robochia Жизнь, which had never fought against the non-revolutionary social democrats in Russia, Trotsky was merely revealing the plan of the liquidators whom he serves faithfully. Parity on the central organ implies the termination of the struggle against the liquidators. The liquidators actually enjoy full freedom to fight the party, and let the party be tied hand and foot by the parity of the Golos and party men on the central organ, and on the central committee. This would assure complete victory for the liquidators, and only their lackeys could pursue or defend such a line of action. Instances of unprincipled pseudo-unity schemes that promise peace and happiness without a long, stubborn, desperate struggle against the liquidators were provided at the plenary meeting by Ionov, Inokentiev, and other conciliators. We saw another such instance in the message of our conciliators who justify liquidationism on the grounds of Bolshevik, quote, factionalism. A further example is to be found in their speeches about the Bolsheviks, quote, isolating themselves, quote, from other trends, the Period and Pravda, which advocate an illegal social democratic party, unquote. The italics in this remarkable tirade are ours. Just as a small drop of water reflects the sun, so this tirade reflects the utter lack of principle in conciliationism, which is at the root of its political impotence. In the first place, do Pravda and the Period represent social democratic trends? No, they do not. For the Period represents a non-social democratic trend, Otzevism and Marxism, and Pravda represents a tiny group which has not given an independent and consistent answer to any important fundamental question of the revolution and counter-revolution. We can call a trend only a definite sum of political ideas which have become well defined in regard to all the most important questions of both the revolution, for we have moved away but little from it and are dependent on it in all respects, and the counter-revolution. Ideas which, moreover, have proved their right to existence as a trend by being widely disseminated among broad strata of the working class. Both Menshevism and Bolshevism are social democratic trends. This has been proved by the experience of the revolution, by the 8 years' history of the working class movement. As for small groups not representing any trend, there have been plenty during this period, just as there were plenty before. To confuse a trend with minor groups means condemning oneself to intrigue in party politics. The emergence of unprincipled tiny groups, their ephemeral existence, their efforts to have their say, their, quote, relations with each other as separate powers, all this is the basis of the intrigues taking place abroad, and from this there is not, nor can there be, any salvation, except that of strictly adhering to consistent principles tested by experience in the long history of the working class movement. Secondly, and here we at once observe the practical transformation of the conciliators' lack of principle into intrigue, the message of the Parisians is telling a downright and deliberate lie when it declares, quote, Otzevism no longer finds open adherents and defenders in our party, unquote. This is an untruth and everybody knows it. This untruth is refuted by documentary evidence in Period number 3, May 1911, which openly states that Otzivism is a, quote, perfectly legitimate trend within our party, unquote. Or will our very wise conciliators assert that such a declaration is not a defense of Otzivism? It is when people cannot justify their close association with this or that group on grounds of principle that they are compelled to resort to a policy of petty lies, petty flattery, nods, hints, i.e. to all those things which add up to the concept intrigue. Period praises the conciliators. The conciliators praise Period and falsely reassure the party with regard to Otzivism. As a result, there is bargaining and haggling over positions and posts with the defenders of Otzivism, with the violators of all the decisions of the plenary meeting. The fate of conciliationism and the substance of its impotent and miserable intriguing is secretly to assist both the Otzivists and the liquidators. Thirdly, quote, joint work with the liquidators in Russia is impossible, unquote. Even the conciliators had to admit this truth. The question is, do the Period and Pravda groups admit this truth? Far from admitting it, they state the very opposite. They openly demand, quote, joint work with the liquidators, and they openly engage in such work. See, for example, the report of the Second Period School. Is there even a grain of principle and of honesty in the proclamation of a policy of rapprochement with groups which give diametrically opposite answers to fundamental questions? We ask because an unambiguous and unanimous resolution of the plenary meeting recognized the question of liquidationism to be a fundamental one. Obviously not. We are confronted with an ideological chasm, and irrespective of the most pious intentions of X or Z, all their attempts to span it with a bridge of words, with a bridge of diplomacy, inevitably condemn them to intrigues. Until it has been shown and proved by reliable facts and a review of the most important questions that Period and Pravda represent social democratic trends, and no one during the year and a half following the plenary meeting has even tried to prove this since it cannot be proved, we shall not tire of explaining to the workers the harmfulness of those unprincipled stratagems, of those underhanded stratagems, which are the substance of rapprochement with Period and Pravda as preached by the conciliators. It is the first duty of revolutionary social democrats to isolate these non-social democratic and unprincipled groups that are aiding the liquidators. The policy which has been and is being pursued by Bolshevism, and which it will pursue to the end despite all obstacles, is to appeal to the Russian workers who are connected with Period and Pravda, over the heads of these groups and against them. I've said that after a year and a half of domination in the party centers, conciliationism has suffered complete political bankruptcy. The usual answer to this is yes, but that's because you factionalists were hampering us. See the letter of the conciliators, not Bolsheviks, Herman and Arkady, aliases of Danishevsky and Kalinin, respectively, in Pravda number 20. The political bankruptcy of a tendency or group lies precisely in the fact that everything hampers it. Everything turns against it, for it has wrongly estimated this everything, for it has taken as its basis empty words, sighs, regrets, whimpers. Whereas in our case, everything and everybody came to our assistance, and herein lies the guarantee of our success. We were assisted by the Patrusovs, Larins, Levitskys, for they could not open their mouths without confirming our arguments about liquidationism. We were assisted by the Martovs, Dons, and others, for they compelled everyone to agree with our view that the Golos group and the liquidators are one and the same. We were assisted by Plekhanov to the very extent that he exposed the liquidators, pointed out the loopholes left open, quote, for the liquidators by the conciliators in the resolutions of the plenary meeting, and ridiculed the, quote, puffy and, quote, integralist passages in these resolutions which were passed by the conciliators against us. We were assisted by the Russian conciliators, whose quote-unquote invitation, extended to Mikhail, Yuri, and Roman, was accompanied by abusive attacks upon Lenin, see Golos, thereby confirming the fact that the refusal of the liquidators was not due to the insidiousness of the quote factionalists. How is it, my dear conciliators, that, notwithstanding your virtue, everybody hampered you, whereas everyone helped us in spite of all our factional wickedness? It was because the policy of your petty group hinged only on phrasemongering, often well-meaning and well-intentioned phrasemongering, but empty nonetheless. A real approach to unity is created only by a rapprochement of strong factions, strong in their ideological integrity and an influence over the masses that has been tested by the experience of the revolution. Even now, your outbursts against factionalism remain mere words because you yourselves are a faction, one of the worst, least reliable, unprincipled factions. Your loud, sweeping pronouncement in the information bulletin, quote, "not a centime for the factions," was mere words. Had you meant it seriously, could you have spent your centimes on the publication of the message platform of a new group? Had you meant it seriously, could you have kept quiet at the sight of such factional organs as Rабочая Gazeta and the Diary of a Social Democrat? Could you have abstained from publicly demanding that they be closed down? Note from Lenin here, in fairness it should be stated that the Paris Conciliators, who have now issued their message, were opposed to launching of Rабочая Gazeta. They walked out of the first meeting to which they were invited by its editors. We regret that they did not help us to expose the futility of conciliationism by openly denouncing Rабочая Gazeta. Back to the main text. Had you demanded this, had you seriously stipulated such a condition, you would have simply been ridiculed. However, if, being well aware of this, you confine yourselves to languid sighs, does it not prove over and over again that your conciliationism remains suspended? The disarming of the factions is possible only on the basis of reciprocity. Otherwise, it is a reactionary slogan, extremely harmful to the cause of the proletariat. It is a demagogical slogan, for it only facilitates the uncompromising struggle of the liquidators against the party. Anyone who advances this slogan now, after the attempt of the plenary meeting to apply it has failed, after the attempt to amalgamate the factions has been thwarted by the Golos and Viperiod factions, anyone who does this without even daring to repeat the condition of reciprocity, without even trying to state it clearly, to determine the methods of control over its actual fulfillment, is simply becoming intoxicated by sweet-sounding words. Bolsheviks unite. You are the only bulwark of a consistent and decisive struggle against liquidationism and Nazism. Pursue the policy of rapprochement with anti-liquidationist Menshevism, a policy tested by practice, confirmed by experience, such as our slogan. It is a policy that does not promise a land flowing with the milk and honey of, quote, universal peace, which cannot be attained in the period of disorganization and disintegration, but it is a policy that in the process of work really furthers the rapprochement of trends which represent all that is strong, sound, and vital in the proletarian movement. The part played by the conciliators during the period of counter-revolution may be described as follows. With immense efforts, the Bolsheviks are pulling our party wagon up a steep slope. The Golos liquidators are trying with all their might to drag it downhill again. In the wagon sits a conciliator. He is a picture of meekness. He has such a sweet, angelic face, like that of Jesus. He looks the very incarnation of virtue, and modestly dropping his eyes and raising his hands, he exclaims, "I thank thee, Lord, that I am not as these men are." A nod in the direction of the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, insidious factionalists who hinder all progress. But the wagon moves slowly forward, and in the wagon sits the conciliator. When the Bolshevik factionalists smashed the liquidationist Central Committee Bureau abroad, thereby clearing the ground for the building of a new house, for a bloc, or at least a temporary alliance of party factions, the conciliators entered this house and, cursing the Bolshevik factionalists, sprinkled the new abode with the holy water of sugary speeches about non-factionalism. What would have become of the historically memorable work of the old Iskra if, instead of waging a consistent, implacable, principled campaign against economism and Struvism, it had agreed to some bloc, alliance, or, quote, fusion of all groups, large and small, which were as numerous abroad in those days as they are today? And yet the differences between our epoch and the epoch of the old Iskra considerably increased the harm done by unprincipled and phrasemongering conciliationism. The first difference is that we have arisen to a far higher level in the development of capitalism and of the bourgeoisie, as well as in the clarity of the class struggle in Russia. Certain objective soil already exists for the first time in Russia for the liberal labor policy of Patrusov, Levitsky, Larin, and their friends. The Stolypin liberalism of the cadets and the Stolypin Labor Party, comment Stolypin being a monarchist who is trying to quote-unquote modernize and reform the autocracy in order to preserve it against revolution, continuing, are already in process of formation. All the more harmful in practice are conciliationist phrases and intrigues with those groups abroad which support the liquidators. The second difference is the immeasurably higher level of development of the proletariat, of its class consciousness and class solidarity. All the more harmful is the artificial support given by the conciliators to the ephemeral petty groups abroad, Viperiod, Pravda, etc., which have not created and are unable to create any trend in social democracy. The third difference is that during the Iskra period, there were illegal organizations of economists in Russia. Comment, economism here is a specific term not referring to people who are interested in the economy, but a form of revisionism in the Marxist movement, continuing, which had to be smashed and split up in order to unite the revolutionary Social Democrats against them. Today, there are no parallel illegal organizations. Today, it is only a question of fighting legal groups that have segregated themselves. And this process of segregation, even the conciliators are forced to admit it, is being hindered by the political game of the conciliators with the factions abroad that are unwilling to work and incapable of working for such demarcation. Bolshevism has got over the Otsevist sickness, the sickness of revolutionary phrasemongering, the playing at leftism, the swinging from social democracy to the left. Comment what we would call ultra-leftism today. Continuing, the Otsevists came out as a faction when it was no longer possible to recall the Social Democrats from the Duma, parliament. Bolshevism will also get over the conciliationist sickness, the wavering in the direction of liquidationism. For in reality, the conciliators were always a plaything in the hands of the liquidators. The conciliators are also hopelessly behindhand. They came out as a faction after the domination of conciliationism had exhausted itself during the 18 months following the plenary meeting, and there was no one left to conciliate. P.S. The present feuilleton was written more than a month ago. It criticizes the, quote, theory of the conciliators. As for the practice of the conciliators, which found expression in the hopeless, absurd, futile, and shameful squabbles which fill the pages of the conciliators and the polls, bulletin number 2, it is not worth wasting a single word on. And that is the end of the audiobook. I'd say pure fire from start to finish, very useful discussion on trends and factions, highly recommended. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every contribution is encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I would be able to do without that support, particularly as we don't run ads or sponsorships on this channel. So if you like this channel, have learned something from it, would like to see more from it, and would like to help other people learn something from it too, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm, which I understand now only counts comments of a minimum of 8 to 10 words. And remember that we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here into your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.